Number 10. The thalidomide scandal. In the late 1950s, a drug company in West Germany and the United Kingdom began selling a new medicine called thalidomide. It was marketed as a safe sleeping pill for pregnant women. Doctors across Europe, Australia, and Canada began prescribing it widely. The company said it was safe for anyone. They said it had been tested. What they did not tell the public was that the drug had not been properly tested on pregnant women. As the years passed, doctors began noticing something very wrong. Babies were being born with severe physical differences, including missing or shortened limbs. The numbers kept rising. A German doctor named Widukind Lenz began connecting the cases. He traced them back to the drug. He contacted the company with his findings. Instead of acting quickly, the company resisted his claims for weeks. Thalidomide stayed on shelves in many countries during that time. By the time the drug was pulled from sale in 1961, an estimated 10,000 babies worldwide had been affected. Around 40% of those did not survive infancy. In Spain, the drug stayed on the market until the 1970s. The Spanish government did not admit the country had even imported it until 2008. A public inquiry into the full cause of the tragedy was demanded in the United Kingdom for years. In 1976, the government minister formally refused to hold one. No complete inquiry was ever carried out. Survivors are still fighting for recognition and proper support today, over 60 years after the drug was removed from sale. Number 9. Maralinga nuclear tests. Between 1952 and 1963, the British government needed somewhere to test its nuclear weapons. It chose the remote Australian outback, specifically an area called Maralinga in South Australia. The Australian government gave its permission. The people who lived there were not asked. The land was home to the Anangu people, Aboriginal Australians who had lived on that land for thousands of years. Many families were moved away before the testing began. Others were not reached in time. Warning signs were put up in English, a language most of the local people could not read. Between 1956 and 1963, 7 nuclear devices were detonated at Maralinga. Hundreds of smaller tests were also carried out involving radioactive materials. The smaller tests actually left more contamination in the soil than the bigger blasts. Aboriginal people who were in the area during the tests later described seeing a black mist rolling across the land. They gave it the name Puyu. People who walked through it became sick. Families developed fevers, skin rashes, and eye problems. Some went blind. Cancers appeared in the communities in the years that followed. A royal commission in 1985 found that the safety of Aboriginal people had been treated with what it called ignorance, incompetence, and cynicism. One British official at the time had reportedly dismissed concerns by saying that a dying race could not influence the defense of Western civilization. The land was not returned to its traditional owners until 2009. The British government has never paid direct compensation to the Aboriginal people who were affected. Number 8. Stasi surveillance state. The German Democratic Republic, commonly known as East Germany, was a country that officially did not trust its own people. From the 1950s until the country ceased to exist in 1989, its secret police force, known as the Stasi, ran one of the most thorough surveillance operations in human history. At its peak, the Stasi employed one full-time officer for roughly every 63 citizens. This does not include the unofficial informants, ordinary people recruited to secretly report on their friends, neighbors, co-workers, and even family members. Historians estimate there were around 174,000 unofficial informants operating at any one time. The Stasi kept files on an estimated 6 million people in a country of about 17 million. Letters were opened and resealed. Bedrooms were bugged. Scent samples were collected from suspects in sealed jars, kept in archives so that dogs could track them later. People who asked too many questions, applied to leave the country, or listened to the wrong music could find their careers, families, and friendships quietly destroyed. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 and citizens stormed Stasi headquarters in early 1990, officers were seen frantically shredding documents. They destroyed so many files by hand that bags of torn paper filled entire rooms. Volunteers later spent years piecing together shredded pages by hand, a project that took decades. The government had tried to erase the evidence of what it had done. Much of it survived anyway because there was simply too much to destroy in time. Number 7. Infected blood scandal. From the early 1970s through the early 1990s, the British National Health Service gave tens of thousands of patients blood products that were contaminated with serious viruses. Patients with a blood disorder called hemophilia were especially affected. They needed regular treatment made from donated blood plasma to help their blood clot. That treatment, imported largely from the United States, was contaminated with hepatitis C and HIV. The NHS knew, from early on, that the plasma being imported came from high-risk donors, including paid prisoners and people in poverty. Mixing plasma from up to 60,000 people per batch meant that one infected donation could contaminate an entire supply. This risk was documented and discussed internally. It did not stop the treatment. Patients were not told they had been infected, often for years. Many only found out when they became seriously ill. Those who asked questions were met with silence or were told there was no problem. A final public inquiry published in May 2024, after 6 years of investigation, concluded that the scandal was the worst treatment disaster in the history of the health service. It found that the government, the NHS, and doctors had tried to cover up what happened by, in the inquiry's own words, hiding the truth. More than 3,000 people have died. Over 30,000 were infected. Successive governments refused to hold a public inquiry for decades, with the first full inquiry not announced until 2017. Number 6. Chernobyl cover-up. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine exploded. It was the worst nuclear accident in history. The blast sent radioactive material across Europe and caused contamination over an area of more than 50,000 square miles. The Soviet government knew within hours what had happened. They chose not to tell their people. For nearly 3 days, no public statement was made. The town of Pripyat, home to 50,000 people living just a few kilometers from the reactor, was not evacuated until 36 hours after the explosion. Officials held a major outdoor parade in the nearby capital of Kyiv weeks later, despite clear evidence of rising radiation in the air. School children marched through the streets as the radioactive plume drifted over the region. Declassified KGB files revealed years later that Soviet authorities had been aware of dangerous safety problems at the Chernobyl plant as far back as 1984, 2 years before the disaster. Those warnings were kept secret. Internal documents showed the government later developed secret plans to store meat that had been contaminated with radiation in government reserves, without telling citizens what they were eating. The rest of the world only found out that something major had happened when sensors at a nuclear power plant in Sweden began detecting unusual radiation levels on April 28. Swedish authorities traced it across the border into the Soviet Union and raised the alarm internationally. Number 5. Unit 7, 131 cover-up. During World War II, the Japanese military ran a secret research facility in occupied China called Unit 731. It was officially described as a water purification department. Its real purpose was to develop biological weapons, and it operated for nearly a decade. After Japan surrendered in 1945, a team of American investigators arrived to find out what had happened. What they discovered was a program of scientific research that had used thousands of people, mostly Chinese prisoners, as unwilling test subjects. The scale of what had taken place was vast. The researchers who ran Unit 731 knew they were in trouble. They offered a trade. They would hand over all of their research data, every detail of what they had learned, in exchange for one thing: immunity from prosecution. American military commander General Douglas MacArthur agreed. The deal was made secretly. Evidence of Unit 731 was classified by the United States. Documents were removed to American archives. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, which put Japanese leaders on trial after the war, was never told about what had happened at the facility. No one involved in running Unit 7. 131 was ever prosecuted by Japan or the United States. Many went back to work as doctors, professors, and government officials. Japan did not officially acknowledge that the unit had conducted experiments on human beings until 1988. A Japanese court confirmed for the first time in 2002 that biological warfare had taken place. Number 4. Operation Gladio. After World War II ended, NATO and the United States Central Intelligence Agency began building a secret network across Western Europe. The idea was straightforward on paper. If the Soviet Union ever invaded Western Europe, trained groups of fighters hidden in each country would resist from the inside. They were called stay-behind armies. They were never publicly announced. Hidden weapons caches were buried in forests and mountainsides across more than a dozen countries, including Italy, Belgium, Germany, Greece, and Portugal. Volunteers were trained in secret. The program ran for decades without most government citizens knowing it existed. In 1990, Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti stood before the Italian Senate and confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. A secret army called Gladio, meaning the sword, had been operating in Italy since the 1950s. Within weeks, Similar networks were confirmed in Belgium, Germany, Greece, and other countries across Europe. What made the revelations deeply disturbing was not just the existence of the secret armies. Investigations in Italy linked Gladio operatives to a series of bombings and attacks during the 1970s and 1980s that had originally been blamed on left-wing groups. A 1969 bombing in Milan that killed 17 people was eventually connected to right-wing operatives with ties to the network. The goal, investigators concluded, had been to create fear among the public and shift political opinion away from the political left. Number 3. Rainbow Warrior bombing. In July 1985, a ship called the Rainbow Warrior was docked in the harbor of Auckland, New Zealand. It belonged to Greenpeace, an environmental group, and was preparing to lead a protest voyage to oppose French nuclear weapons testing in the Pacific Ocean. France did not want the protest to happen. On the night of July 10, 2 bombs attached to the hull of the ship exploded while the vessel was in port. The Rainbow Warrior sank. A photographer named Fernando Pereira, who was below deck retrieving camera equipment when the second bomb went off, was killed. He was 35 years old and had a family. New Zealand police began investigating immediately. Within days, they arrested 2 individuals carrying fake Swiss passports. They were French military intelligence agents. French authorities initially denied any involvement. French government officials suggested to the media that other groups might have been responsible. The French foreign minister publicly stated that France was not involved. The truth came out within months. A French newspaper reported that the operation had been personally approved at the highest levels of the French government. The French defense minister resigned. France paid New Zealand $13 million USD in compensation and issued a formal apology. The 2 agents who were convicted of manslaughter in New Zealand served only a fraction of their sentences before France arranged their quiet return home, claiming one needed medical care and the other was pregnant. Both were later given military medals by the French government. Number 2. The Iran coup. In 1953, Iran had a democratic government. Its prime minister was a man named Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been elected by the Iranian parliament and was popular with much of the Iranian public. That year, Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil industry, which meant the Iranian government would take control of its own oil rather than allowing a British company to keep the profits. The United Kingdom, which controlled the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, did not accept this. It reached out to the United States for help. Together, the CIA and British intelligence ran a covert operation called Operation Ajax. The plan was to remove the elected prime minister and replace him with a ruler who would be more favorable to Western oil interests. Agents paid protesters to cause disorder in Tehran streets. Newspapers were bribed to print negative stories about Mossadegh. False rumors were spread. Eventually, military forces staged a coup. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah was reinstalled as the ruler of Iran, with full power. Iran's oil went back under foreign control. The operation was kept secret for decades. The CIA did not officially acknowledge its role until 2013, 60 years after the event. The British government took even longer to offer a public acknowledgement. A senior CIA historian later described the coup as a turning point that had permanently shaped how many Iranians viewed Western governments. Number 1. Operation Paperclip. As World War II ended and Allied forces swept across Germany, American officials faced an urgent problem. The German military had developed rocket technology far ahead of anything the Allies had. The scientists behind it were now available. Some had already been captured. Some were wanted for war crimes. A decision was made. More than 1,600 German scientists and engineers would be secretly brought to the United States to work for the American military and space program. The operation was called Paperclip. The problem was who these men were. Some had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had directly used forced labor from concentration camps in their wartime factories. Under American immigration law at the time, people with such records could not be admitted to the country. To get around this, government officials altered or simply removed the most damaging parts of the recruits' files before sending them for approval. Clean papers were clipped over the old ones. That is where the name came from. The most famous recruit was Wernher von Braun. He became a central figure in the American space program and helped design the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon in 1969. He had been a member of the Nazi Party. His wartime rocket factory had used forced labor. These facts were classified. Operation Paperclip was not officially declassified until 1973. The scientists it brought to America shaped weapons development, space exploration, and military research for decades. On the night of the moon landing, millions of people celebrated. Most had no idea who had built the rocket that made it possible.